Hello and welcome to the latest episode in Garfield AI's podcast series called Litigating AI. My name's Philip and I'm the CEO of Garfield. And in this podcast series, I have the privilege of speaking to very interesting people who are involved in the law tech AI revolution, either as founders, policymakers from government, legal technologists, people within law firms, people that buy technology, buy AI products, all sorts of people. Today, I'm privileged to be joined by Emelie Skoghag. Hello, Emelie.
Hello, Philip. Thank you for having me.
How did I do? Did I manage to pronounce your surname?
Oh, you did brilliant. Absolutely.
So that's one thing I've been really worried about for the last few days. But for the listeners' benefit, I should say that Emelie very kindly gave me a hint as to how to pronounce a surname, so I didn't sound too uncultured. I'm going to say a couple of quick things about Emelie, because I'm sure otherwise she'll be very modest and wouldn't say it herself, and then we'll jump straight into it. For me, one of the most interesting parts of the AI revolution as far as it relates to law is that it is creating essentially a new type of profession. And we now have people who, in some cases, used to be lawyers, in some cases, used to be technologists, who sort of jump into the other world and become a bit of both. And so lawyers who become technologists become legal technologists, and technologists who start to do more law become legal technologists from the other direction. And Emelie is such a person. So Emelie, let's begin with the obvious question. How would you describe a legal technologist? What is your role and what has been your background to get to this point?
So I would say that being a legal technologist pertains to working in the intersection between tech and law. I work currently as a legal technologist at DLA Piper Sweden, and my experience includes working with everything from procurement of legal tech tools, implementing said tools on a firm-wide scale, as well as working with legal transformation projects, enabling AI-enabled processes throughout the firm and driving innovation. So it's a business development point of view within the tech sphere in legal, I guess you could say.
So you talked a bit about buying and training, but it sounds like you also do a bit of building as well internally?
Yes. So it sort of is the whole flow from end to end. Everything from actually identifying what is the relevant tools to be looking at. I mean, we never start off on a whim by saying we're going to buy a tech, we're going to buy a new tool. Rather, it's a long process of primarily focusing on the frustrations and pain points of the colleagues or clients that we are working with, all the way up to adoption, implementation, upskilling, and then building workflows within those tools. And I should note that there's always some chaining involved as well. So if you do have a tech stack that is quite extensive, obviously you don't want to use those tools in a silo. So building those workflows from end to end, implementing the entire tech stack within. So we make sure that we don't have any licenses that are sitting and collecting dust somewhere.
Well, exactly. Yes, you've got to spend the money sensibly, don't you? So I think we're going to jump into that really interesting explanation in a bit more detail in a few moments. But I thought we'd also talk a bit about how you've got here and what's your journey. Because I think you're a lawyer by background.
So I actually started off on the NGO path. So I was working at a nonprofit called Gatujuristerna, which offers free legal advice and legal representation in the administrative courts to the unhoused and vulnerable in Stockholm, Uppsala, Malmö, and Lund in Sweden. And thereafter, I moved into, at first I did a short stint at Serious Law School in Hamburg, where I specialized in legal technology and operations, as well as law firm strategy and management. And then I joined DLA Piper back in 2022 with the legal tech department. So coming from the legal side of things, but having those business process improvement experiences throughout, I would say. So that's sort of what drove me into the direction of legal tech, aside from obviously having a tech and AI interest.
Would you say that it's really, really helpful to have a legal background moving into this world? Do you think it gives you advantages against somebody who might just have a tech background moving into a legal technologist role?
There are benefits, I would say, namely in that lawyers can only explain so much. And usually it's on a overarching level. So it's quite easy to describe a general workflow. But then when you do try to specify it, it usually tends to narrow down to, well, it depends. or you actually end up being stuck in the difficulties of people being unable to explain the exact process. So they might say, well, then I contact the client, but how do you do it? Is it an email? What's in the email? What's in the contents? What needs to be a part of the deliverable here? So I think having a legal background can definitely aid in that, but it's not a requirement, I would say, by any means. But the fact-finding mission sure is easier.
You sort of speak the language of the lawyers to the lawyers, and it sort of helps as sort of a bridge of translation. One thing on this topic that I found really interesting is, so I've had a very similar experience at Garfield, but what I found interesting is sometimes being gently challenged back by, in my case, the development team who aren't lawyers, when they will sometimes say, okay, well, you say, Philip, that a lawyer would do this, but actually, approached objectively and without any sort of prior experience of doing it as a lawyer, surely it's more rational to do that. And they offer a different answer. And of course, sometimes I'd say, no, it's not right. That's not right because, and there'd be a good reason because. But sometimes I think, actually, yes. Actually, that's why do we do it that way? We should do it the way they've just suggested. That's so much more rational. And so do you have that experience from time to time where actually you look at legal workflows and think this process is making it more efficient? We can improve on things that lawyers would otherwise historically do.
Absolutely. I usually work from a framework as well, where it's an iterative process where you start off not narrowing down on how to implement the process in tech, so for example, how to build an AI-enabled workflow, but rather you start off with the core issue. So what is the frustration or the pain point there? And that can be quite hard to define, but usually after a couple of layers, you kind of get to the bottom of like, oh, it's actually this thing that's bothering me. And then you might take a completely different approach. Usually it's after you find or locate the exact issue, you move on to the process and the process mapping. So there might be changes to the process that could be implemented today that doesn't require any tech at all, where it's just a unspoken rule or norm where it's always being done that way and no one's ever challenged why that is. But it's quite often that you also land in the latter box, which is the product. So you actually do need a tool to alleviate that frustration. But you can't jump off in the deep end, so to say. I think you have to start off with the groundwork and actually do the process mapping and see what can be improved with sort of the quick wins today before moving on to actually finding a tool that's suiting the issue. Because most of the time, if you do buy in a tool and you want to fit it properly to the current process, it gets so convoluted and it's so complicated that usually there's not a single tool out on the market that's going to be the right fit for that process. So you might have to be open to adjust the process to fit the tool rather than the opposite.
Yeah, and that makes perfect sense. I thought it was really interesting what you said then about the fact that sometimes as part of your sort of looking at the processes being undertaken, you find that there are efficiencies that can be gained that actually don't need some whiz-bang complicated AI solution. It's just that having an independent third party look at it and say, hang on a moment, why do we do it this way, is itself valuable. So actually sort of legal technologists don't just add value because they say, oh, we can put AI into this and make your life easier or solve this problem. They also add value by saying, actually, we don't need an AI tool, we can solve it this other way.
Well, yes, certainly. It's definitely a benefit, I think, coming from a firm-wide perspective. So one of the key benefits that I pertain to my job, at least, is that I do this business process improvement work in every competence group, meaning that I have a reference point in regards to how other practice groups work in their core processes. And that's something that we have worked extensively on, is the core process mapping throughout the firm. And it's funny because you actually do find a lot of similarities, even in fields that you wouldn't necessarily think are the same. I did an initiative a couple of years back where I offered sort of a one-to-one partner session with all the partners at the firm, where you could book an hour with me where I would go through the current legal tech stack that we had with the goal of keeping everyone up to speed. Obviously, this opened up a second, more interesting side effect of it, or added bonus of it, which was that I started off every session by asking the partner to describe their day-to-day work. And that actually led to them describing their workflows and how they worked in their legal area. And that was really interesting afterwards because you were able to find out so much more about similarities, not just in type of legal work, but what type of documents do they work with? Are there similarities between how often it's agreements or the size of the material, the scope of the work, or how can we better find synergies here? It doesn't really have to do with tech at all, but it did help us to identify the core practice groups when testing certain types of tools. So it was a benefit moving forward as well, both for the firm and for the practice groups, I would say.
Yeah, I imagine the partners would have learned from that quite a lot about not just what tools they've got, but also what further tools might be available that might help them in their day-to-day work. So just talking a little bit more about how you map workflows, how does that actually work? Do you sort of sit down with lawyers in a department and say, tell me about how you deal with this particular matter or what do you do on a day-to-day basis? And then you just sort of do sort of Q&A with them? Is that how that works?
We've done a variety of different methods. So depending on the size of the workflow, because I want to divide that term up to meaning a bunch of different things. So if you talk about the workflow, that's end-to-end legal process, that's quite a large project. It usually involves tons of lawyers and array of workshops set up. Perhaps you pull in multiple practice groups, etc., etc. So it's quite larger undertaking. Whereas if you're focusing or narrowing it down to only a single workflow where you have to do a specific task, for example, then usually it might be a sit down, it might be an in-depth interview where you're talking about not just perceptions, but expectations and describing what you want a workflow to be like and what the current process is and what's sort of the key metrics that need to be met, as well as some formalities that need to be set up, as well as where you need humans in the loop, etc., etc. It's very dependent on the size of the workflow, I would say. If you work with core processes, then you do need to make sure that you are eliminating any chance that there's person-dependent step in this process. Some people can be very particular about the way things are done, but that might just be them.
Yes, particularly
and
lawyers.
I mean that lovingly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So in that case, you do kind of need to have a few reference points, control groups where you're checking up and asking people independently of each other to make sure that you're not following the whim of someone who's done it that way since eternity. And that's because it's supposed to be that way. And usually that's being done by these said control groups and sort of extracting information or testing the information against the others. So at times it might be that I would suggest that as a possibility, and then they would usually respond by saying, no, we don't do that, or yes, that would actually be great, or that's not how I do it at all, but that sounds good. So you can sort of benchmark it against the other people in the firm as well.
When I was a very young lawyer, back when dinosaurs roamed the earth, inevitably when you're a young lawyer, you work on cases for multiple partners in a law firm, and every partner's got their own way of doing things. And one of the exciting challenges of being a young lawyer was that you had to understand how the partner you worked on in a particular case wanted to do things, which might be wildly different than another partner you're working for simultaneously, and you don't want to get them all confused. And I did obviously at that time think that's all a little bit inefficient. I may have perpetrated the same thing myself when I was a partner, so maybe I didn't learn very much there. But I'm wondering, is there a bit of a challenge for legal technologists in this, in that you have to be sort of tactful as well, because you might have to go into a department and persuade some partners who are quite sort of insistent in their ways that actually the majority consensus is that is no longer a good way of doing something, and here is a preferred way of doing it. And I'm also mindful in this that I also have known the odd partner or two in my time, and I'm not going to name names, of course, who would quite happily agree to change a process. And then you'd find out sometime later that, in fact, they just reverted back to their old process the moment when its back was turned. So I imagine there's a certain degree of needing to sort of persuade and cajole people to sort of adopt something new.
In some regards, yes, you do need to be mindful so that everyone is on board on the train. And the last thing that we want is for us to iterate and actually create a process that then doesn't get followed. If it's very clear that certain individuals have a strong preference in their ways of working, you can actually shift your mindset to see that as a feature rather than an issue. So that's usually something that we also build into the workflow. For example, this milestone needs to be flexible. Before this stage, we do need to ensure that there's a flexibility in the way of to going forward. Obviously, that can't be done in every single workflow, but if it's a matter of preference on, let's say, certain types of phrasing, then clearly that's something that can be built in as well. It doesn't have to be, as with everything in AI, it doesn't have to be completely stagnant. So you can build that flexibility and build out the tree structure of what to do when moving forward. It's something that, if at least speaking from my experience, that I've built in, for example, when you utilize previous precedents from the firm, then I might have two batches where it's one partner's typical writing in one batch and perhaps the rest in another.
In a different batch.
Exactly. Or it might be, divided up. So there might be 4, 5, 6, 7 different ones. It's dependent on how many people have strong opinions on the ways to structure things. But seeing as you don't have the same challenges with AI today compared to previous machine learning tools where you needed huge amounts of training data and validation data, etc., whereas today you could probably make use of a few good examples. It's not really that much of a hurdle anymore to actually being able to customize or build bespoke workflows. So I would say that it's very much about being a good listener to seeing the needs of the organization and for the team as well. Because I think if you do find that you get those people on board, it usually changes the entire adoption of the workflow. And it might be small things. It might be very, very small things that needs to be changed. Usually it's never required that I need to set up separate batches. It might be as easy as knowing that the final check should be in a certain way. But I think it's a benefit regardless, because once you map out the process and you find out that this partner actually requires this to consider the work done correctly, then what you're doing is actually you're codifying those uncertainties that I'm sure that a lot of junior lawyers have regardless. So the mapping is actually part of the process improvement as well.
And makes junior lawyers' life a bit easier as a consequence because it reduces some of those uncertainties. I guess this sort of raises a sort of ancillary question about adoption as we're on that topic at the moment. And that is, are there ways to sort of make adoption easier by making it more fun? And in saying this, I'm always mindful of some advice I was given as a very young lawyer by a very senior, in England, we call them a silk. It was then a Queen's Counsel, but now a King's Counsel barrister. He's a very funny man as well as a very effective barrister. And part of the reason he's very effective is he's very amusing. He entertains judges. And he said part of the way you persuade people to reach a conclusion or do something is you become engaging. They look forward to listening to you if you're an advocate or using your product, or otherwise it's a pleasurable experience as opposed to a painful one. Is there any sort of ways you can make adoption easier by making it a bit more fun?
Oh, that's actually one of my favorite topics. I'm glad you asked.
What a coincidence. Imagine me asking that question.
No, certainly. It's, I think, being able to deliver any sort of content in an engaging, enthusiastic manner is definitely a way to combat sort of the information fatigue or the resistance to learning that we find today. In particular, because lawyers are busy as they are. So being able to make learning material or new information or adoption initiatives something fun is actually a great way to make it more accessible. And there's sort of the trickery against the information fatigue, because I think most people are familiar with opening up the intranet and seeing new information, and you can't really take it in because you're stressed, you're in the middle of something else, and you're thinking of your client's matter that you're in the middle of and how to tackle that one. So how to disrupt that flow of information and that information fatigue. I think one of the best things you can do is to add a bit of gamification elements to it. One of the things that we were requested to do during a Nordic conference that we were holding was to talk a bit about legal tech at the firm and how we work with it on a mindset level. Sadly, none of me or my colleagues were able to attend the session. So they had asked us to send a recorded speech on the topic, which might be the worst format for talking about innovation efforts, is to have a pre-recorded session. So I think we had to toy with the format a little bit to make people still engaged. I'm not sure if you know it, but there's a YouTube channel called 72 Questions with Vogue. Or it's a show from Vogue magazine where they walk into different celebrities' houses and follow them along as they ask 72 questions.
Wow, that's a lot of questions.
Yes, but it's usually one of the like picking one of the apples or the other, so apples or pear, etc., etc. And the celebrity answers questions while they walk through their gigantic homes. So we decided to take the same approach, but walking through the office at DLA Piper Sweden, firing rapid fire questions about legal tech and the legal tech team and our work with innovation at DLA Piper. And that was really appreciated. I will say that it took quite a few attempts before we got the final version. One of the issues we had was that our videographer was wearing heels at the time, and we heard the clicking throughout the video, so we had to redo everything. But we walked through the entire office, including going down the elevator into the lounge, grabbing a coffee, etc., etc. And it was a really fun way to toy with how you put forth information. And it's something that I still get asked about nearly 3 years later, if I still have that video. So it really can make an impact if you make it more fun or take a more creative approach.
And with gamification, is that trying to sort of engage with people's dopamine channels and giving them a little bit of reward if they follow the right processes in the right way?
That's one element of it. So everything from, if you use Microsoft Planner, if you check under the My Day tab and you tick off all the tasks that you've done for the day, it will pop up with a star saying you did it. So to sort of give you those little dopamine hits of you completed all of your tasks today, and that's brilliant work. So that's sort of a very narrow example of gamification efforts. So it's integrating game elements like points, tier lists, challenges, games to sort of raise motivation or raise engagement. And it's really thinking creatively on how to make a process more fun. So it can be everything from sending out the top user along with a gold star on the internal channel to bump up the leaderboard, if you will. And to give credit where it's due, clearly. Or it can be implementing the fun into a process or a learning process. And there's some really interesting initiatives that's being done, say, in legal tech in general. It's also just building it into a process where you can. So, for example, when we run pilots testing a new legal tech tool at DLA Piper Sweden or testing a proof of concept, we usually tend to have quite a lot of checkoff lists. That's also with gamification elements. So it's sort of like completing the next level in a mobile game app.
It reminds me of a conversation I had a very long time ago, and there was some discussion about making a particular thing fun. And one of the most senior partners in the room, he sort of bristled at that concept. He said, fun? Law's not supposed to be fun. It's a job. And I remember at the time thinking to myself, well, why shouldn't it be a bit fun? I mean, lawyers work very long hours, work very hard. They're very devoted to the work they do and trying to achieve their clients' outcomes. And why shouldn't a big part of their life be at least a little bit fun? I really like the idea of encouraging adoption by adding these like beautiful little touches, what some people refer to as delight moments that just help to sort of inject a bit of a sparkle into your legal day as a working person in a law firm. Let's move on to another topic, actually, that I was also going to ask you, and that is measuring impact from all of this. I mean, I don't want you to sort of talk about DLA's internal sort of secrets and stuff, but just on a very high level perspective, how do you sort of measure impact with this sort of workload? Do you have any particular metrics? Can you quantify sort of reduction in risk? Those sorts of things.
I think it's dependent on what you pick as a value metric, to be honest. That tends to be different for every single process, I would say. If the value metric might be cost cutting, you're going to have different types of KPIs. And if we're talking quality enhancement or extra trust, etc., then those are going to be completely different. I will say that there's, in general, quite a challenge that we have today in measuring adoption, and it is a bit fussy. And I think a lot of it pertains to the fact that it's a disconnect between seeing, user statistics and raw data and what sort of connections you can do with that. I do like to talk not only about ROIs, but also ROE. So not just return on investment, rather return on experience. So that's sort of circling back to the people part of the process, and how do our colleagues and clients experience the work and the output with these new tools in place, etc., or with a new workflow in place. That is something that I think is equally valuable, because it obviously ties in with a lot of other important questions. So everything from client retention to colleagues retention, clearly, and colleague satisfaction as well as quality. So I think it's something that needs to be looked at with a very critical eye, and to not just go based on the numbers, but to take in a large array of data. And by that, I mean complementing usually with not only the raw usage statistic that you're looking at, but taking in other factors, conducting in-depth interviews or sending out questionnaires based on experience, etc., to sort of complement the picture and to get the full gist of the actual added benefit.
That makes perfect sense. It reminds me very much of discussions I used to have as a lawyer, where when you are selling legal services, particularly sort of work I used to do, which was big ticket, complex commercial dispute stuff, you never sold on cost. You only ever sold on quality and client experience. And cost was it was a factor, but it's very much a secondary factor, because clients were looking for somebody to help them who they would not only get really good legal assistance with, but also enjoy working with. They'd get a satisfactory human experience as well. And ROE is a very interesting idea to me, because I really think that it might be slightly overlooked at the moment with people talking about the AI revolution in law tech, because people are focusing a lot, particularly in the media, on cost. But really, yes, they should be focusing a lot more and primarily on how the experience improves, as you say, for clients, for practicing lawyers, for everyone actually in the ecosystem, the court staff, everyone. Moving on to just another quick topic, data reality. Now, this is something that is very strongly in my wheelhouse, because one thing I used to be very conscious of at my former firm, CYK, was that in law firms, data tends to be everywhere, and it's not consistent and it's not coherent. So lawyers will save data in different places in different ways. There wouldn't be sort of one data repository that could be mined. And in fact, I'm thinking back to the really old days when I first started, where there would be boxes of paper absolutely everywhere. Some people would have rooms full of boxes of paper, and you'd always think, how the earth could they operate? But actually, they seem to know where everything was. That's presumably one of your challenges, that you're needing to try and impose more sort of consistency and coherency onto the data that flows through a law firm in order to sort of build AI processes on top.
Both yes and no. In terms of keeping our own ducks in a row, yes. So everything internally is certainly a part of that equation. How do we structure our own documents, and how do we structure our own, management systems, and throughout, how do we make that neat, coherent, and reliable? But part of the reality today is that we cannot enforce our clients to use the same neat, structured boxes that we use. It's frankly not realistic that we can require the exact same level of structured works as what we currently have in our mapping systems with metadata, etc. So I think you do need to be mindful when you're both in procurement and in building workflows later on, that you need to have structures in place to allow for that flexibility. It's really hard to build a workflow based on everything working as it's supposed to. I mean, I've seen data come in all shapes and forms, and some are harder to read than others. So that's just the reality of a lawyer's everyday life. And there are ways to alleviate it, to ensure that the flexibility actually works. So being able to be quite active in driving development with your suppliers or partners on different aspects of said tools that need to be flexible. Being able to use drag or drop, or incorporating zip files, or building on to that flexibility is something that we, as in this case, the actual customer, need to be really strict about to ensure that our tools alleviate that issue as much as possible. But also being humble about the fact that it will be difficult, because there will always come up with a new issue that you've never seen before, and that's a complete new, unheard of question that will appear. So it's the balance of keeping the own data structured, having the flexibility of taking in raw data that is completely unstructured, and implementing good systems and processes on our side on how to structure that raw, unstructured data. I mean, that's certainly something that can be done with the help of AI or similar tools.
And that's, of course, been a big part of my life the last 2 years, because we get unstructured data at the beginning of a case, and then we have to impose order and coherency on it. One of the things I find quite amusing as part of what we deal with is that here in England, we've got this court API, which is incredibly useful, but it is getting a little bit obsolescent. And I don't think I'm upsetting anyone by saying that, because I think even the court service would like to have a brand new one. And certainly I know the judiciary would, and so would practitioners. And it's interesting that some parts of the process are handled by the API, but then there's some parts of it that suddenly you start getting emails from court officials. And of course, some court officials will have one process, and some court officials have a different process. Even though there is an overarching set of civil procedure rules, they all have their own interpretation. And so you then have to end up building a tool that can handle multiple different forms of data. So, not just sending data programmatically over an API, suddenly you're receiving unstructured emails and having to sort of deal with those. It's part of the fun of legal AI, I think, sort of having to handle this world. I think over time it will get better, because, of course, there'll be more and more APIs, there'll be more structure put on different data types, and we'll end up with sort of common standards at some point, I think, for a lot of things, some of which will be imposed from the outside. So I imagine, for example, as courts start to deploy APIs, that will inevitably impose standards upon people that use the court services. So there's two further topics I just wanted to take your mind on before we close. The first topic is the future role of junior lawyers and what your thoughts are there. And obviously, I'm getting a bit long in the tooth now myself, but you are much younger and you will have sort of opinions which are much closer sort of to, because you're in the same generation. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering what your thoughts are on junior lawyers and what their future holds.
Ooh, good question. I would say the future role of junior lawyers, I think, will be very exciting to see in the near future. I don't think it's going to be as apocalyptic as some of the legal news reported to be. I think we're going to see a shift in what type of tasks a junior might have done in the past comparatively to what they do today. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, particularly with the fact that the younger generations are brought up with AI natively already. So I think it won't be anything weird in their eyes when they enter the workforce and are already using AI, because they have been using AI the whole time. I do think there's going to be a awkward few years, perhaps, where we need to iron out the kinks of how training actually is going to be done and how do you tackle those questions. And I don't think that's something that I will be able to answer today. It's going to be a long, ongoing discussion. But I see a shift in the role of mentorship. And I think that mentorship will take a much larger role, that it will be less of sort of the filling out forms work that may have been tasks of the past, where we can automate a large chunk today with the use of AI and other tools. I don't know. What do you think?
I've been going around saying what I think on this topic. So my own view of this is, I think, first of all, I agree with you entirely. I think it's a very exciting time to be a junior lawyer. I think what's going to happen is that a lot of the dog's body work that junior lawyers have inflicted upon them at law firms is going to go away. And I'm not being rude to anyone there, because a very long time ago, shortly after sort of the Jurassic period, I was a junior lawyer myself. And I had to do a lot of due diligence exercises and disclosure and taking notes of meetings and trying to take a note of a judge talking in court. Time intensive, but not particularly high value tasks. I think a lot of that will go. And you end up doing the sort of work that I wanted to do as a junior lawyer, the higher value stuff, like thinking about strategy and advising on the case, on how to develop the arguments and interviewing witnesses and doing negotiations and settling cases, stuff like that. So I think that's very exciting. One thing actually I've not mentioned yet in any of my occasional sort of usings is something I heard actually not so long ago, just the other day. And it was a junior lawyer speaking, and it was really interesting. She was saying that one of the things about her job she used to find very stressful was she didn't really felt that she had somebody she could turn to with lots of what she would regard as sort of basic questions. So she sort of muddled through. And she said she found that very stressful, but she didn't know if what she was doing was right. The reason that she said she didn't feel she could turn to anyone was that she felt the partner she worked for was too busy. And also she felt embarrassed about asking the questions of another busy lawyer. And she said that she feels a lot less stressed now because she's got a law tech product as a sort of a buddy on her computer. So if she gets really stuck, she can say, hey, what about this? And she'll get an answer. And most of the time she feels like she's got the level of experience already to be able to evaluate whether the answer is a sensible one or not. And I thought that's great because she was saying that it actually materially was reducing her stress level on a weekly basis, which I think is a really positive thing. Have you seen that within DLA? People saying, hey, I'm a bit less stressed now because of all these great things.
Word by word.
Okay.
I've actually had that verbatim being said to me when I conducted a in-depth interview. Gosh, it must have been in February of 2024 or something, like ages ago, where we were following up based on a pilot testing that had been done. And one of the junior associates specifically said the added benefit of having a legal buddy that she could use as a sounding board. So that was definitely to bounce back ideas and sort of get the first, I know this is a dumb question, but other times it might just have been sufficient to use it as a sounding board, get a quick recall, and then be confident again and moving on.
Yes, I mean, it's definitely a positive thing. So traditionally, in a lot of English law firms, particularly bigger ones, lawyers tend to share an office anyway. And the idea is, as a junior lawyer, you learn from osmosis from the more senior person in your room. But not all English law firms do that. And of course, many are small and can't do that. And I know a lot of foreign law firms don't take that approach whatsoever. You know, you just get given an office and off you go. And so I can see that it might be a very valuable thing across the entire global legal community. This is sort of a general lowering of legal stress across the world. Let's move on to the final topic. Can you think of one thing that has surprised you the most about your journey through legal AI and being a technologist at DLA? Something you've seen that you thought, gosh, that's really surprising.
Yes. So something that surprised me the most, I would say, is that people often tend to underestimate how open-minded lawyers are to change. So I would actually say that with the right preparations, it's not a hurdle. It's rather something that people are actively seeking and are welcoming with open arms. So something that surprised me would say how easy it is to find time. Even though you talk about lawyers being very, very busy and that there's a lot of, work on their plate, which certainly is true, but just how open people are to working with improvements and innovation. And I think that's something we've definitely seen grow exponentially, in particular since the AI boom, where people might have had preconceived ideas in the past of how long the startup process was of implementing a new tool. Whereas today, people can see that we can be up and running in quite little time. It doesn't necessarily take that long anymore. People are so much more open to working with business improvement and get tickled by the thought of improving things, even if that means improving the metadata, which might not sound like the most exciting thing. No. But weirdly enough, some people really love it. So, myself included. So you can definitely find people are willing to take the time everywhere. And I think that's a really nice surprise. I definitely had a preconceived notion that people were going to be too busy to talk. I've found the opposite to be true completely.
Maybe partly it's because all their stress levels have been reduced by all the AI they're already using. No, I'm semi-joking, because that led back to the last sort of topic we were talking about. I know exactly what you mean about the point about it depends upon from what level you're looking at, what lawyers do and what their processes are. But you can obviously look from a very high level where you can conceptualize everything, or you can look from a very low granular level where you're literally looking at exact steps that someone's doing. And whenever we get onto this sort of topic, Dan always teases me a lot. So my co-founder, Dan, and he likes to point out that from a very, very high level indeed, you can see a lawyer basically as a function. And the inputs are information and coffee, and the outputs are documents. And I said to him, I think there's a bit more to the legal experience than that. But I mean, anyone with a mathematics background obviously can easily think in terms of formula and functions. So I think this has been a wonderful opportunity to talk about what legal technologists do, Emelie. And I think it's very exciting. You're, I think, very much at the vanguard, at the front of almost a new profession, a new area of legal services, which is sort of combining the best of both worlds. And I think it's going to be very exciting to see what you and other people who have got the same sort of role as you in other big law firms build and come up with and buy and adapt. And I'm very grateful that you've joined me today. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.